welcome to the European University Institute Max Weber interview series, where we talk with distinguished scholars and authors about their recent work, specifically work that shapes the discussion across academia, not limited to a particular single field. I am Ben Mueser, a Max Weber Fellow at SPS. I'm joined today by Tommaso Milani, a fellow, also a Max Weber Fellow in History. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Till van Rahden to talk about his most recent book, Democracy, A Fragile Way of Life. Professor van Rahden is the Chair of German and European Studies at the University of Montreal. He is the author of numerous articles and books on German Jewish history, especially the celebrated 2008 Jews and Other Germans, which examines Jewish integration in the half-century before the Weimar Republic. We had great pleasure of reading and engaging with his new book, which offers a new approach to the history of post-war Germany through the lens of experiments with democratic living in private and public life. I'm also glad to say that this is the first in-person interview in the series that we'll be doing. We're very happy to be in the same room together and get to engage with each other in person. We'll be talking for about 30 minutes or so, 5 or 6 questions. And to start off, I'll pass to Tommaso for our first question.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Professor van Rahden, for being with us. Our first question, just to break the ice, is about the project in general. Why have you decided to write this particular book, and what has brought you to this particular project at this stage of your research and your career?
So, thank you so much, Ben, Tommaso, for having me, first of all, and thank you for the question. So the short answer is my editor contacted me and asked me to write a book on democracy that wouldn't be a history of elections or parties or parliaments, but that would look at democracy more broadly. And this was now about 3 years ago, and as you can imagine, 2018-19 was an intense time when people were discussing the crisis of liberal democracy. But a slightly longer answer is that about 20 years ago, I started writing or researching a book about the history of fatherhood in 20th century Germany. And as I started to work on the topic, the first thing that I stumbled across was that the interest in such a question actually fluctuates greatly. There are moments in which the question of the father is central to what we may call the political imaginary. And if one traces the fluctuations in the context of 20th century German history, one sees that the time period between the immediate end of the Second World War and the late 1960s, early 1970s, is where the public interest in the question is at its height. And if one starts reading the source material, one realizes that one of the big questions that is at stake when people discuss the question of the father is really the question of authority. What is legitimate authority? And once you enter that territory, you're obviously in a territory that is familiar to people who are interested in questions of democratic theory. Because what is a legitimate form of authority in a society in which citizens are imagined as equal? So what is the relationship between a necessarily horizontal idea of authority and a necessarily vertical relationship between democratic citizens? So that was the beginning of my interest. And so I started writing a couple of essays on democratic fatherhood and the democratic family. And as I was then trying to get a grip on the historiography of democracy, I realized that there's an astonishing contrast between an almost endless number of studies that explore the rise of fascism and the demise of democracy, particularly in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and a very small number of studies that actually make the question of how democracy comes about and how democracy survives central to their own work. And the very few studies that work in that tradition often then focus on election, parliament, governments, constitutions, etc. And so I was coming to the question of how is democracy even possible from an angle that was slightly bizarre, slightly marginal, and was much more focused on cultural and social issues, and most importantly, as I said in the beginning, on the figure of the father and the political imaginary that is attached to the figure of the father.
Fascinating. My second question deals with methodology and the kind of perspective you chose in order to investigate your topic. The book looks into post-war Germany from a moral history perspective. How would you define moral history and what can we learn from it?
So I'm afraid I don't have a sort of neat, clean definition of what moral history is in my understanding. But let me just begin by pointing out what it is not. So oftentimes historians, when they address moral questions, are tempted to pass on moral judgment about the past. So we use our own moral imagination as a yardstick against which to judge actions in the past. In my understanding, my focus, however, is less about judging moral behavior in the past, but understanding it on its own terms. So on some level, it's a very sort of simple historicist take. What did good or bad behavior mean in the 1920s or in Nazi Germany or then in post-war Germany? So in a sense, I'm trying to understand moral debates, moral controversies, moral obsessions through the eyes of the contemporaries rather than through my own moral obsessions. And one of the working assumptions for me in this context is that post-war European democratic theory, and particularly post-war German democratic theory, is dominated by an obsession with reason and rationality. And it has something to do with the fact that fascism, and particularly National Socialism, are imagined as the triumph of the passions over reason, as something very irrational. And to me, that has always seemed like a very odd way of thinking about it, because some of the key concepts that we use to describe our own moral imaginary, let's say justice, or responsibility, or solidarity, in fact carry a sentimental component, right? We feel that something is just or unjust. We feel that someone on whose solidarity we had depended or had hoped for actually betrayed us. But these are not rational judgments. These are things we feel and sort of judge as on how should I phrase this, as a kind of it's a sentimental issue that is at stake. This is not to say that reason has no place in this context, but that moral judgments are often based on sentiments and very strong emotional responses on our part.
Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Tommaso. My mask off to speak. Thank you for this. The third question I want to get to a bit of how the book is framed. And it's framed in a significant way, as I understand it, as a response to the Ernst Birkenförde and Charles Taylor thesis that liberal democracy relies on social or moral preconditions that it cannot itself either guarantee or reproduce. In what ways are the episodes that you sketch an answer or offer a potential answer to that thesis?
Both Ernst Wolfgang Birkenförde and Charles Taylor make a very important argument that I fully agree with, namely that democracy as a system of government does not exist in thin air, but is and presupposes a very rich, thick set of cultural and social preconditions. The key question then becomes is how shall we think of these preconditions? And both Birkenförder and Charles Taylor's answer is that the preconditions are best understood as moral and ethical. But they both suggest that democracy ultimately depends on a certain ethical, moral, substantial consensus. And one of the first things I think one understands when one starts to think about democratic theory and acknowledges the centrality of freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, is that what you end up with in a liberal democracy is a never-ending series of conflicts over moral and ethical issues. And it's not that Taylor and Birkenförder wouldn't be aware of this, but I think that their vision was always that it would be possible to come to a, let's say, thin minimal consensus concerning such things. But I think that it's not implausible that a sort of consensus emerges at a short moment in time, but it's the exception. As a rule, this sort of culture of conflict, discord, strife is what makes liberal democracy tick and what makes liberal democracy unique and what makes liberal democracy the open-ended experiment that it is. So the question then becomes, if discord, strife, conflict, perhaps even enmity are characteristic of public controversies in a liberal democracy, how can we conceptualize the preconditions? And here then the answer becomes that it is not norms and a normative consensus, but a consensus about forms. It is important that we agree on how we debate over moral issues, how we conduct controversies over ethical paradoxes, how we navigate moral incommensurabilities. And then the whole question of form, of style, of manners becomes central and in fact foundational for a democratic society and ultimately also for democracy as a system of government. And this applies to a whole wide range of sort of empirical questions and phenomena. In my book, the focus is on questions of child rearing, education, the family, but you could ask very similar questions by exploring, let's say, urban planning in the post-war period, by exploring cultures of sort of public discord, public protest, and trying to understand not what the ideological substance is that is being articulated, but how it is articulated, and how the conflicts that cannot be resolved but only navigated are framed by the forms in which these conflicts develop. Right? And so the key here is it is not a sort of substantive consensus that makes a liberal democratic culture possible, but a consensus concerning the forms in which we navigate discord, strife, conflict, and even enmity.
That's fascinating. I think that really well previews the next question, which speaks about the relationship between these different forms of life. So much of the book, as you said, focuses on these episodes in domestic life. Child rearing, you spoke about the figure of the father, masculinity especially is a big role. Then the final chapter shifts a bit and speaks about the life cycle, the rise and demise of a public pool in Offenbach. And it offers the thought that perhaps democracy requires significant public investment. So what relationship do you see specifically between the structure of family life, the structure of private life, and the maintenance of public spaces like pools?
I'm not quite sure whether I see a kind of structural relationship, but let us speak of an elective affinity more than a structural relationship. So the underlying assumption of the argument is that whatever else democracy is, it is also based on the idea that the authority of the government rests on the voluntary consent of the governed. That's obviously a very old idea. But government by consent, if one unpacks that formula, can only mean that mature, autonomous, free citizens voluntarily consent to being governed. And so the whole source of legitimate power in the context of representative government is the idea of maturity, and the idea of maturity then is tied to a democratic ethos. And that democratic ethos, again, doesn't sort of drop from the sky, but is something that we cultivate throughout our whole lives, but especially in our childhood and adolescence. And this is why the family and other educational institutions, whether it's a kindergarten, school, or later than a university, are so central in this context, that they provide citizens with opportunity to cultivate the very virtues that then coalesce into the idea of a democratic ethos. If this then becomes an elective affinity, the sort of more, let's say, material structures, economic preconditions, if you will, are there, but they serve as a kind of enabling context for the development of a democratic ethos. So what I call a democratic commons, the whole set of institutions where citizens can come together, despite the fact that they happen to be living in very different cultural milieus, very different social classes, but when it comes to, let's say, public libraries, swimming pools, parks, again, schools, to some degree universities, they come together and they experience alienation, they experience strife and conflict, they experience moral incommensurabilities, but they also experience freedom. They experience, potentially at least, equality. And so that whole set of material institutions that I call a democratic commons, that are accessible to all citizens and invite, in fact, all citizens to actively participate in public life, have an elective affinity to the same cultures of maturity and autonomy that we carefully cultivate in the realm of education.
Thank you. Tommaso, next question.
Yeah, my final question deals with politics. The book tackles specific aspects of German history by discussing how ordinary citizens experience democracy in their everyday life. Do you believe that political actors play any meaningful role in consolidating or accelerating these developments, or perhaps even in resisting them? And broadly speaking, what role does politics play in your interpretation of post-war German history?
So let me just begin by saying the answer depends on what you mean by politics, right? But I understand, obviously, there's a sort of very important argument in that in your question. But before I try to answer, so this book is obviously not about politics in the narrow sense. It is not about governments. It is not about parliaments. It is not about elections, and it's only tangentially about a liberal constitution. But if we are primarily interested in the question of a democratic ethos, democratic manners, then obviously everyday experiences, whether it's in a school, in a family, in a kindergarten, in a park, in a swimming pool, at a demonstration, become central to our conception of political life and public life. And what is important here to me is that I'm making that argument not because I want to belittle democracy as a system of government, but I want to highlight that a narrow focus on democracy as a system of government is not helpful if we want to understand what keeps democracies alive. And this brings me to your question about what can politics in the narrow sense do. Politics in the narrow sense, and I think this is something that political leaders of all parties in the immediate post-war decades understood, was that to build a liberal democracy is not just about having a parliament and having parties, but it's cultivating a certain way of life and providing the material resources that we often identify with the welfare state that would allow for democracy to flourish. Now, the welfare state consists of, in a sense, two different distinct parts. One is we redistribute wealth through unemployment benefits, housing benefits, etc. And that's all fine and good, and that's a key element of the welfare state, and then we can argue endlessly where the limits of that kind of welfare state are. But on the other hand, and that was something post-war politicians were very aware of, the welfare state is this whole set of institutions that I call the democratic commons. Right? That services, public spaces that are there free of charge, or let's say at a minimal charge, that allows for citizens to come together and to experience democracy, and that is experience equality, experience freedom in their daily lives. I'm not quite sure when this sort of keen sense of the social and cultural prerequisites of liberal democracy disappeared, but it certainly disappeared after 1989 and 90, when at the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the people's democracies that had always provided a kind of provocative counterweight to the market-driven liberal democracies of the West. So when the people's democracies collapsed in 1989, 1990, people seemed to think that liberal democracy was like a perpetual motion machine. So once you set the institutions in place, you push them slightly, and they sort of live by themselves and go on forever and ever. And something that we're beginning to get a sense of again in the context of all these conversations about the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populist challenges and new forms of authoritarianism, illiberal democracy, soft authoritarianism, etc., is that the idea that liberal democracy is a perpetual motion machine was actually based on a huge misunderstanding. And that it is, if a liberal democracy as a system of government wants to remain viable, it must provide the material resources for its own survival. And this is something that grew out of some of the anxieties of the interwar years. So a key thinker here is Hermann Heller, who already articulated the idea that a liberal democracy must also be a social democracy, obviously not as a party, as a project of a political party, but something that provides the material resources for its own survival. And that idea is central, I think, to a lot of the post-war West European political order, and it's something that is shared. I mean, there's endless controversy about what this actually means and how this can be translated into concrete politics, but the consensus is there in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s that democracy is fragile, inherently fragile, and therefore a liberal democratic government must do everything it can to ensure its own survival, so to speak. And the most viable strategy is by strengthening democracy as a way of life. And that sort of conviction disappeared, but I think we're in the middle of rediscovering these kinds of intellectual traditions, and maybe I'm naive and just hopeful, or hopelessly naive, but I think that whether it's called democracy as a way of life, whether it's called a democratic culture, whether it's called a democratic commons, I think the questions that these concepts raise and allude to are questions that we'll be discussing in the next couple of years, independently of what our answers, specific answers to these questions will be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the rediscovery of this idea that liberal democracy must provide the material means for its own survival is, I think, the most optimistic part of the book that's what the last question focuses on. Because the book, in a slew of many recent books in political science and sociology, speak about the death of democracies. You say, I want to see what keeps them alive. And so looking at the world today, both in Germany and beyond, do you see any projects or experiments that substantiate this rediscovery, that try to advance a democratic way of life? And perhaps if not, what would that resurgence look like today?
Now, I think the first move that I would welcome, and I don't know whether it's happening, but I would welcome it, is to create an awareness, both within scholarly conversations and public conversations at large, that, how shall I phrase this, I will try to phrase this in a kind of gentle, friendly way, that democracy is too important to be left to the political scientists. And it's not because democratic theory in political science is not fascinating and inspiring, but it's because these aspects, the question of the cultural and social preconditions of liberal democracy, are very hard to grasp, very difficult to get a hold of, very elusive, and, as I would say, often touch on questions that legitimately can be answered either way. And these are things that, because of their elusive nature, are very difficult to capture with sort of scientific methodologies, and let alone measured. So the first thing I would hope for is a much larger, broader conversation about such questions that includes people from literary studies, philosophy, media studies, communication studies, the whole sphere of the arts, because the people who are thinking about aesthetic questions have a much keener sense of not just of forms and of style and of manners, but also of the potential of creativity and free play. And all these categories are categories that are present in certain traditions of democratic theory, but I think they are, to put it gently, marginal within mainstream political theory and political science. So the first thing I would hope for is a much more imaginative, broader, playful conversation about democracy. The specific implications then for politics are similar to the ones I've outlined earlier when talking about the democratic commons, but then again, there's no magic formula how to create a democratic culture. There's no magic formula to revive democratic ways of life. But whatever we do, democracy is not everything, politics is not everything, but whatever we do, let's think about the implications for a democratic way of life. When we think about the challenges of, let's say, education, the school system after the pandemic, what does that mean? How should we respond to that? How are our responses going to either stimulate or hinder the articulation of a democratic ethos? When we think about reviving post-industrial cities, how can we do this? And where should we put our money? Where should we be investing resources? When we design new parks, new inner city areas, again, how is that going to, are we going to enrich the democratic commons through these institutions? And so it's almost like a never-ending set of questions, but in each of these questions there's something substantial that is often independent of a democratic way of life. I mean, a university is much more than talking about democracy, obviously. But let's take it, I don't know, as a seminar on Aristotle's Politeia, and you can argue a whole academic year about the intricacies of Aristotle's argument, and I think that's very much worth it. But the question then is, in what form are we going to do this? How are we going to recognize one another as equal and free in the context of an academic conversation, when the world, in a university, in a school, in a public sphere, is full of hierarchies, inequalities, full of structural forms of marginalization, whether it's racism or any other form of sort of marginalization. And in every context, the question then to me is not that there is this sort of one-size-fits-all formula as a response, but that we enter into a conversation about the sort of democratic implications of whatever we are doing. And so that's sort of the short answer is, I think we need a more imaginative, broader conversation about democracy, and on the one hand, and a broader conception of democratic theory would then allow us to go back to some of the questions that were at the heart of, let's say, American pragmatism in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s, that almost every aspect of public life needs to be infused with the spirit of democracy. And then, again, I don't have an answer what this specifically means in every single context and aspect, and a democratic urban planning would look different in a city like Florence than in a city like Duisburg or Glasgow, or Lviv, or Kiev. But the idea here is that in all of these conversations, we try to ask ourselves, is this something that would help revive, help strengthen a democratic ethos and a democratic spirit?
What I had was about this idea of a moral catastrophe. more about the role of the idea of National Socialism, not as an amoral system or totalitarianism as an amoral system, but as a specific moral catastrophe that a lot of post-war thinking is living in the shadow of, and how that idea structures the way you look at the history of the democratic way of life.
The starting point for me is to take seriously something fascists, and in the particular case of Germany, National Socialists, claimed for themselves, namely that their vision of the good life and the good public order, and even their conception of popular sovereignty, was infused by a deeply felt morality. The murderous, genocidal vindictiveness of National Socialism is embedded in a moral fervor that not everyone who was involved in the crimes believed in, but many believed in. And so they were convinced that genocide, genocidal warfare, was morally justified. And the shock that leads to a breach of civilization that post-war commentators like Hannah Arendt highlight is not a shock that National Socialism was immoral in their view. That's not a surprising conclusion. But the shock that such a murderous, genocidal policy could conceive of itself as morally justified. And that therefore, the whole wide range of moral traditions that constituted European civilization were called into question. How could European civilization give rise to such a monstrous, murderous policy that saw itself as the flag bearer of European civilization? So that's the starting point. And that makes for a very peculiar conversation about morality and moral dilemmas in the post-war period that I actually find a useful starting point. Because if one emphasizes that at the heart of a liberal democracy is really the problem of moral conflicts and the reality of moral incommensurabilities, then the fact that the kind of venerated European civilization is much more problematic than many people assume is in some ways self-evident. So I think that some of the key thinkers such as Isaiah Berlin or Judith Sklar, who emphasize that there cannot be an overarching consensus of any kind, in some ways respond to the very dilemmas that the experiences of National Socialism give rise to. And again, it's not because National Socialism is genocidal and murderous, but because in its own world and own way of thinking about its ideology, it's not just morally justified, but a morally superior form of appropriation of European traditions and civilization. And this is something that I think shapes a lot of the post-war conversations.
Excellent. I can get going with some other questions if that's all right. This one might be a little bit outside of the scope of what you're speaking about, so it's up to you about how you want to answer it, if at all. But when you're speaking before about the answer to Birkenfeld and Taylor being a question not of morals or a particular foundational ideology or something like that, or even homogeneity, but as a way of relating to each other, or a form of relating to each other. And it reminded me very much of the idea of architecture as a fundamental political form. And architecture many times seems to sit in the background of this book, especially with the public pool. And so I was wondering if you could speak about the role of architecture architecture, or perhaps democratic architecture in building or sustaining a democratic way of life?
So there's a short answer and a slightly longer answer. The short answer is, but it's very simplistic, right? It's an architecture that emphasizes the vertical over the horizontal. It's an architecture that emphasizes transparency, so uses a lot of glass and not reflecting glass, but transparent glass. And it's an architecture where the inside and the outside are, where the boundary between the inside and the outside is sort of fluid. And then one can talk about a lot of buildings in this context and check whether they work. But obviously a key architect in this context would be Mies van der Rohe, right, who spent his whole life trying to think about such things. But that isn't the short answer. The longer answer is, and much more elusive again, but it's something that I invite students to think about in these contexts, is as we enter a room, and this is a small room, so it doesn't work as well, but as we enter, let's say, a seminar room, as we enter a lecture hall, as we enter a library, how does it feel? And how does it feel? Am I overwhelmed and awed? Am I invited? Am I, let's think of a seminar room, whether it's in a school or in a university, am I invited to speak? Do I feel invited to speak? Do I feel I can speak as an equal? So what does the room look like? What does the lighting look like? What is the seating arrangement? How does the seating arrangement translate into certain rituals of speaking and an order of speaking? And so architecture in and of itself is less what I'm interested in, but the kind of the material conditions under which we begin to exchange points of view. We begin to articulate our moral convictions and our ability then to navigate the hiatus that exists between my moral conviction and yours, right? And all of that is embedded in a kind of material setting and aesthetic setting in a literal sense. Namely, how does that room, how does that seating arrangement, how does the chair I sit on feel like? How does that make me feel? And does it make me feel invited to speak? And obviously, it makes a huge difference of who is coming into the room, and every person has his or her own history. So again, there's no universal formula, but again, these questions, this is how I would use a tradition architectural theory that has spent a lot of time trying to think about these things, and in very interesting ways, into something a little more, on the one hand, elusive, but on another level, much more concrete, because all I care about is when you're having a controversy and a debate in a certain setting, does that setting allow for experiences of equality and freedom? And the answer can be very, very different, but the question is what really, in a sense, makes me tick, not the answer.
Tommaso, were there any other questions you wanted?
I will keep my questions for the round table, because
Oh,
I will be
okay.
engaging with the book in the
Good.
exam role as well.
Good, okay, excellent.
Well, another question was going back to this idea of the moral history. You described it as a history that speaks directly to the way that morals are felt with sentiment, are felt not abstractly, but in the sentimental emotions. And I was wondering, in what way does that relate to an idea of a history of emotions as a distinct kind of genre?
So I first stumbled across the question of the kind of sentimental basis of moral judgments when I was invited to participate in discussions at a research institute that really focuses on the history of emotions. And they had never, their sort of angle to explore emotions as a form of politics was to explore nationalism, which is perfectly legitimate, and obviously there's a lot of sentimental attachment to nationalism. But my suspicion was that that was too narrow. And to me, I'd always been intrigued by a certain philosophical tradition that, goes back to Aristotle at least, where some of the key concepts of moral philosophy, and the central concept is always justice, are intimately tied to sentiments. Right? And then you have a long tradition in which this Aristotelian conception of moral judgments as sentimental judgments is appropriated, reappropriated in the Scottish Enlightenment, and there the key figure is David Hume, who articulates his conception of a civil society and of a sort of republican order that is supposed to be based on justice as something that necessarily involves the sentimental responses of everyday citizens. And that was something that really stuck with me. There's a long reception of Hume, particularly by sort of feminist philosophers and sort of a democratic theory that is consciously drawing on feminism to articulate a kind of sentimental conception, not just of justice, but of democracy more generally. And then the kind of a la mode form of that is to focus on care and democracy as the key way of trying to understand that. I greatly admire that tradition, but I also think it's too narrow if we want to understand the larger implications of a Humean conception of morality and ethical judgments. And so I would say that there's a certain overlap, but there's also something very specific to highlight the sentimental nature of ethical and moral judgments, as opposed to a very broadly conceived history of emotions that can be used to explore almost any facet of human life. Because where we all, emotions are everywhere, and then you can argue endlessly whether these emotions can be reduced to basic emotions, or whether these basic emotions are, or the category of basic emotions is useless for historical analysis, because the historicity of all these sentiments and emotions is so deep that one can only talk about certain feelings at a certain moment of time, etc., etc. But that's not my, how should I say this? It's not something I find particularly, it doesn't keep me up at night. The question, I'm obviously, this is tongue-in-cheek, but sort of the question what democracy feels like, what equality feels like, what freedom feels like, that's a question that keeps me up at night. But whether this can be sort of mapped neatly onto the question and the concept of basic emotions is not something that worries me.
So thank you so much. So those are the questions that we have for now. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and talking with us. It's a really wonderful and excellent book, and I look forward to the roundtable this afternoon.